this invitation. My presentation is in English, but I will answer the question in French, as my English is not that fluent. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the psychologist's role, how to address this topic, a topic I'd like to extend to that of the psychoanalyst and that of the psychiatrist. Their roles are not very different when it comes to providing psychological support to breast cancer patients. Today, the psychologist is very much in fashion. Should an earthquake or a hostage-taking situation occur, not to mention a string of layoffs in a factory, and the psychological support unit is quickly set up. So, quite logically, hospital breast cancer services have recourse to psychologists, and I think it never occurred to anybody to complain about that. But this shouldn't prevent us from wondering about this practice, and this even leads us to question the validity of extreme views according to which psychology and psychoanalysis play a critical role, even an indispensable one in the recovery process, thus turning the analyst into an all-powerful shaman, whereas others cry out that all that is quite useless, the analyst being regarded as totally incompetent. Those introductory words lead me to wonder about what is expected of the psychologist. To put it simply, who demands, who for, and above all, how to meet those demands. But perhaps we should start at the beginning, and this beginning is particularly grim. I mean particularly grim with the appearance of the word cancer. You are well aware of it, as you can hear it every day from your patient's mouth, as you can also hear it in the street or in the medias. The word cancer bluntly conjures up the notion of death. The word cancer means the end of a carefree life and the beginning of a life of uncertainty and danger. Let's listen to Laura, one of my patients. At that very moment, my world collapsed and death burst into my life. All of a sudden, the truth was self-evident. I could die. A break seems inevitable. The present crumbles into a stream of doubts and uncertainties. There used to be a before. Will there be an after? It's a time of sideration and anxiety, a time when the impression of unreality is most vivid. Stephanie, another of my patients, felt as though she were moving in cotton wool, hearing from a very long way off what the oncologist was breaking to her, which led the latter to pause and ask her whether she could hear him. After all, this kind of tightrope walking between the too much and the not enough, characterizing the relationship between physician and patient, might be the starting point of psychological support. And maybe the psychologist can step in at this point and listen to the physicians and the nursing staff, because we tend to forget that they too have an unconscious and may be the victims of their own reactions. What I mean is that the fact of being listened to and heard may establish a beneficial distance in the relationship between physician and patient. It must be borne in mind that patient will have to get over a double shock. Firstly, the shock of the diagnosis, then the shock of the treatments offered. Concerning physicians, they will have to realize that the information they give and what they do have psychological impacts on their patients, and that those effects will have to be taken into account. All the more so, the path they follow is not always logical or rational. What are we to think, for example, of a patient looking relieved, even pleased at the announcement of the diagnosis? What are we to think of a patient who prefers to take the risk of dying than lose a breast. And what are we to think of the reactions of the physician who happen to get emotional or annoyed or even angry? Lastly, how can they bear hearing and receiving all those often contradictory feelings, not to mention aggressiveness? The key word is probably comprehension. Quite obviously, we are on safer ground, if I may say so, if we are aware of what is being played within ourselves, if we are able to see how we are played, if we can figure out what's happening in others' mind. And in this respect, if the physician listens attentively to what the patient has to say or wants to say, a lot of treatment, I mean a lot of psychological treatments, may be done without. But don't get me wrong, I don't mean that the physician must play the analyst. It's not his job, and he hasn't been trained to do that. But this shouldn't prevent him from listening to his patient and providing her with psychological support, far from it. And what does psychological support consist in? It consists in agreeing to listen to the plurality of his patient's reaction and in understanding that their terror is not always in keeping with the seriousness of the medical treatment. For example, Rebecca, another of my patients, Rebecca's tumorectomy plunged her into floods of tears, whereas Catherine's only wish is to undergo a mastectomy so that the malignant cells that attack her breast should be eradicated. How can all this be explained? Well, we all function in accordance with psychological bearings, which are developed all through life, and cancer casts its shadow over those bearings and landmarks. When the word cancer is uttered, psychic life gets shattered. The woman's sense of identity falters, and the capacity for thought freezes, and its revival will be a gradual process. The patient's image gets blurred, self-image gets blurred. Whether it is surgery, radiotherapy, or chemotherapy, the treatments affect the body and will certainly bite into the psyche. In The Ego and the Id, Freud reminds us that if we touch the body, the mind shudders. So what? Well, the mind begins to race as it realizes man's finiteness, and thinks of those treatments that appear so barbaric, and the medical terms that sound so strange, all of them jumble up in the patient's mind. I'm nothing than anxiety, Rebecca says to me. The patient can no longer identify herself with the woman she used to be, the one who was in good health, worked, and lived in all innocence. And this accounts for the violent fits of crying, the outburst of distress and sideration when the diagnosis is announced to her. Each patient will then have to manage to emerge from the state of shock and find the psychological means to come to surgery, follow the treatments, live on with the disease, and put up with the threat of recurrence, and all the while maintaining a relationship with the friends and relatives. Unconscious defense mechanisms will thus develop in the form, for example, of denials or rationalizations. And at each stage of the disease and treatments, the patient will have to perform some psychic working on the self. Alors, what's it's all about? Quite simply, it's about reconstructing bearings and landmarks that may be called into question at the next stage. Stephanie, for example, has gradually emerged from the fog in which she'd been moving about. She agreed to undergo surgery and had started receiving chemotherapy. And anxiety may still be present, but it doesn't prevent her from normally undergoing a course of treatment and even smiling at times. Actually, psychological distress which can leave patients low in the majority of cases, only a necessary phase of adaptation to the disease and its treatments. The important thing might be to give way to those emotions and affects and to accept the idea that they are an integral part of the self without trying to establish scale of the quality of life or to explain how each patient is going to respond to the various treatments or even prescribing a small pill if the patient cries too much or not enough. We know that it so happens that some physicians prescribe an antidepressant because, as they say, prevention is safer, the odds are you won't be feeling well. But doesn't this amount against erasing each individual's peculiarity? Doesn't each patient have the right to respond to a cancer in different ways? Doesn't she have the right to cry? Because it is really sad to have a cancer, isn't it? But she also has the right to laugh because having cancer doesn't deprive her of a sense of humor. What I mean is that in any given circumstance, a wide range of possibilities is open to each of them. Given the wide range of situations, a patient's reaction may rightfully be one of anger, when she is often counseling as if her affects, which are so justified, were regarded as something pathological. So let's be quite clear about this. Whenever a patient expresses the desire or the need to see a psychologist, it is necessary, it is essential to meet a demand. But I don't think that the analyst should be used to eradicate the patient's effects. That is, when you come to think of it, for peace sake. But things are not that simple. Quite obviously, the primary question is to be able to distinguish the normal from the pathological. The answer of psychoanalysis is in terms of quantity, degree, and if you see what I mean, in terms of too much, in terms of excess. Let's take the example of anxiety, which is a distress signal, the signal that the patient feels unable to face a cancer, and this is understandable. Anxiety becomes a symptom only when it is repetitive and excessive. Some patients are paralyzed, physically and psychologically speaking. They can't move, think, and communicate. Sophie, for example, is huddled up in a corner, unable to bear any contact, any word, unable to allow the installation of the cannula. She is obviously suffering from an excess of anxiety. It will take a few sessions for us to realize that this intrusion into her body, this open door, as she will say, bring her back to her mother's repeated intrusions into her life when she was a child. Those intrusions robbed her of a personal space of freedom. Dealing with what prevents people from acting and enjoying a normal life, Freud explains that inner conflicts and the range they bring about are likely to stop or break off the elaboration working, which show the acuteness of the patient's psychic suffering. The question is then how to enable the patient to express in her own way, with her own words, what is the cause of such a strong mental block. The losses related to the cancer, reviving other traumas experienced in a former life and repressed since then. Sophie can't bear anything anymore. She can't bear the chemo sessions. She can't bear the healthcare team's empathy or her husband's attention. The only thing she wants is a bed. She longs to bury herself beneath the covers, which in a way are a kind of healthful wound. She doesn't want to hear the word cancer, protocol, mastectomy anymore. She will need both the help of drugs and the supportive therapy in order to be able to resume a treatment which anxiety and terror had stopped. What does all this mean? It means that the psychological experience of women suffering from cancer is a subjective truth, each case being unique and not transposable. But this also means that all of us can put together our own experiences and practices and jointly think about the possible psychological repercussions of breast cancer, in general terms, of course, but this thinking will prove useful as it establishes bearing and landmarks for patients, but for doctor and nursing staff as well. This leads us to the often debated question, when should a patient be referred to a psychologist? The first thing to bear in mind is that the patient should be informed that a psychologist is available in the unit, as some straight away feel the need to talk to a psychologist. Others had been feeling this need for a long time, but had put off making the decisions, maybe for lack of time. Let's listen to Rebecca. Now, with the cancer, I've got time to myself. The time of diagnosis may not be the right time, because usually it's not the patient's main concern. Some are even unable to take in the fact that it is possible for them to see an analyst. So, when? I think there's no single answer, and caution and tact are the watchwords. Actually, some patients may need psychological support at the termination of radiotherapy. Some may collapse after undergoing conserving surgery, although reconstruction went off fairly well. But I'd like to point out that some patients collapse at the discontinuance of the treatment. They dread the moment the oncologist will tell them that they'll see each other once a year now that she's fine. The psychologist's role is to listen to the patients, to try and understand that if their pain doesn't respond to any analgesic, it may concern something else, something affecting the psyche. If, for example, vomiting occurs before the drip is put on, it may indicate an underlying depression. One must never lose sight of the fact that cancer spins its web in the body, briding the life urge. So, the daily meetings with patients suffering from cancer show us that nothing is ever simple or definite. Strange as it may seem, instead of causing a depressing reaction, a somatic disorder may arise a kind of relief. Others live through this rough time facing up the disease. They succeed in singling out painful events and coping with them like so many challenges. So, as I've said, some patients wish to see an analyst. For others, it's a necessity. If psychoanalysis is seen as a practice and not as a theory, its function is to free vital forces from the psychic conflicts that confine them. What is to be hoped for is that after those dark days, there will come a time for a fresh objective investment. While cancer brings about a real personal revolution in the patient, a psychic elaboration may occur, driving away ghosts and giving rise to a reconstruction, both physical and psychic. Paradoxically enough, the disease restores the life urge, the need to take up again plans that had been laid aside, to revive dreams that had been forgotten about, and the hope emerging from the death of suffering invites us to a constant creation. Thank you very much.